Behind every dictator lies a trail of personal destruction that often remains hidden from history books. While the world knows Joseph Stalin as the iron-fisted leader who terrorized millions, few understand the intimate horrors that unfolded within his own household. The women who shared his name, his bed, and his life faced a nightmare that would make even his political enemies shudder. Tonight, we uncover the dark secrets of Stalin's marriages, stories of manipulation, terror, and tragedy that reveal a monster far more personal and calculating than history has dared to tell. What happened to the women brave enough, or unfortunate enough, to become Stalin's wives? The truth is more disturbing than you could imagine. In 1906, a 27-year-old Stalin married his first wife, Ekaterina Svanidze, known as Cato. She was barely 19, the daughter of a Georgian railway worker, and reportedly the only woman Stalin ever truly loved. But even this so-called love story carries shadows that historians have only recently begun to illuminate. Cato was described by contemporaries as gentle, religious, and devoted. She bore Stalin a son, Yakov, in 1907, yet within just 4 years of marriage, she was dead. The official cause was listed as typhus, but the circumstances surrounding her final months paint a far more sinister picture. During their brief marriage, neighbors reported hearing frequent arguments from the Stalin household. Cato had begun to lose weight dramatically in the months before her death. Her sister-in-law later recounted that Cato had confided fears about her husband's increasingly violent temperament and his involvement with revolutionary activities that she found morally disturbing. Stalin's own behavior during Cato's illness was peculiar. Rather than seeking the best medical care available, he seemed almost indifferent to her declining health. When she finally succumbed in December 1907, Stalin's reaction shocked even his closest associates. At her funeral, he was reported to have thrown himself dramatically onto her coffin, declaring that his heart had died with her. Yet within weeks, he had abandoned their infant son and returned to his revolutionary activities with renewed vigor. What makes Cato's death particularly suspicious is the pattern it established. Stalin had already shown signs of the paranoid control that would later define his political career. Cato had begun questioning his methods and expressing religious concerns about his violent revolutionary activities. For a man who would later eliminate anyone who posed even the slightest challenge to his authority, a questioning wife represented a dangerous liability. The Georgian Orthodox Church records from the time reveal another disturbing detail. Cato had sought counsel from local priests about her marriage, expressing what church documents describe as grave concerns about her husband's spiritual condition. She had reportedly asked whether she could seek an annulment based on what she termed her husband's unnatural behaviors. But Cato's story becomes even darker when we examine what happened to her family after her death. Her brother, Alexander Svanidze, initially maintained a close relationship with Stalin, even serving in important government positions after the revolution. However, in 1937, during Stalin's Great Purge, Alexander was arrested on fabricated charges of being a German spy. He was tortured for months before being executed. Alexander's wife, Maria, was also arrested. Under interrogation, she reportedly revealed disturbing details about Stalin's treatment of Cato that had never been made public. Maria claimed that Cato had confided in her about physical intimidation and threats from Stalin when she questioned his activities or tried to impose her religious values on their household. The systematic elimination of anyone who knew about Stalin's first marriage suggests a deliberate effort to erase inconvenient truths. When Stalin rose to power, he carefully crafted his image as a devoted revolutionary who had sacrificed personal happiness for the cause. The reality of his first marriage, a young woman who died under mysterious circumstances after challenging his behavior, didn't fit this narrative. Even more disturbing is what happened to Cato's grave. Initially buried in a prominent cemetery in Tbilisi, her remains were quietly relocated multiple times during Stalin's rise to power. Each move seemed designed to further obscure her story and eliminate places where people might gather to remember her or question the official version of events. The few photographs of Cato that survived Stalin's purges show a woman who appears increasingly gaunt and fearful in later images. Her eyes, once bright and hopeful in early wedding photos, take on a haunted quality that speaks to experiences no young wife should endure. But if you think Cato's story is disturbing, What Stalin did to his second wife reveals a level of psychological torture that defies comprehension. 18 years after Cato's death, Stalin married again. This time, his bride was Nadezhda Alliluyeva, known as Nadia, a woman 22 years his junior, who had known him since she was a child. The age gap was disturbing enough, but the circumstances of their courtship reveal a predatory pattern that would define their entire relationship. Nadia was just 16 when Stalin, then 39, began showing romantic interest in her. Her family, longtime Bolshevik supporters, saw the match as politically advantageous. Nadia herself was initially flattered by the attention from such an important revolutionary figure. She had no way of knowing she was entering a marriage that would become a psychological prison. From the beginning, Stalin exhibited obsessive control over his young wife. He dictated what she could wear, whom she could speak with, and where she could go. Nadia was forbidden from working outside the home despite her intelligence and political interests. When she expressed a desire to attend university, Stalin dismissed the idea entirely, stating that her only role was to serve him and bear his children. Their first years of marriage produced 2 children, Vasily in 1921 and Svetlana in 1926. But parenthood did not soften Stalin's treatment of his wife. If anything, it intensified his controlling behavior. He viewed the children as extensions of his own power, and frequently used them as leverage against Nadia when she displeased him. Nadia began experiencing what family members later described as severe depression and anxiety. She lost weight dramatically and developed chronic insomnia. Stalin's sister-in-law noted that Nadia often appeared at family gatherings with unexplained bruises and a demeanor that seemed perpetually terrified. The psychological abuse escalated as Stalin's political power grew. He would disappear for days without explanation, then return to interrogate Nadia about her activities with an intensity that bordered on paranoid. He installed household staff who reported her daily activities back to him, essentially turning their home into a surveillance operation. But it was Nadia's growing awareness of Stalin's political atrocities that truly sealed her fate. As he consolidated power in the late 1920s and early 1930s, she began to learn about the mass deportations, executions, and engineered famines he was orchestrating. Her privileged position gave her access to information that horrified her increasingly fragile mental state. Party documents that came to light decades later reveal that Nadia had begun questioning Stalin directly about his policies. She challenged him about the treatment of kulaks during collectivization and expressed shock at reports of mass starvation in Ukraine. For Stalin, these questions represented a fundamental betrayal. His own wife was becoming a political liability. The final months of Nadia's life were marked by what can only be described as systematic psychological torture. Stalin would bring home detailed reports of executions and deportations, seemingly taking pleasure in watching his wife's horrified reactions. He began making veiled threats about what happened to people who questioned his methods, even within his own family. On November 8, 1932, at a dinner party celebrating the 15th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, witnesses reported a particularly vicious confrontation between Stalin and Nadia. He berated her publicly for her bourgeois sentimentality and her interference in matters beyond her understanding. When she attempted to respond, he told her to shut up or face the consequences. Nadia fled the dinner in tears. That night, she was found dead in her bedroom with a gunshot wound to the head. Stalin's pistol was beside her body. The official cause of death was ruled self-inflicted, but the circumstances raised disturbing questions that have never been adequately answered. The position of the wound, the lack of powder burns consistent with close-range firing, and the complete absence of any note or prior indication of suicidal intent all point to a different conclusion. Perhaps most tellingly, Stalin's reaction to his wife's death was utterly devoid of genuine grief. Within hours of discovering her body, he was making arrangements for the funeral and crafting the narrative that would be presented to the public. He showed no interest in investigating the circumstances or seeking answers about what had driven his wife to such a desperate state. The funeral itself was a carefully orchestrated performance. Stalin played the role of the grieving widower, but those closest to the family noted the calculated nature of his emotions. His daughter Svetlana later wrote that her father seemed almost relieved by her mother's death, as if a troublesome burden had been removed. In the days following the funeral, Stalin systematically eliminated anyone who might have information about Nadia's final months or the true nature of their marriage. Household staff who had witnessed his treatment of her were quietly reassigned to remote locations or simply disappeared. Family members who had been close to Nadia found themselves under surveillance or facing sudden career setbacks. The official narrative that emerged painted Nadia as a woman tragically overwhelmed by the stresses of revolutionary life. Stalin was portrayed as a devoted husband whose wife had succumbed to mental illness despite his loving care. This version of events was so thoroughly enforced that it remained unchallenged for decades. But Stalin's treatment of his wife's memory reveals the depth of his calculating cruelty. He had her body moved multiple times, preventing the establishment of a permanent memorial. He destroyed most photographs of her and removed her belongings from their home as if she had never existed. Most disturbing of all, he began telling people that Nadia had betrayed him through her self-inflicted death, framing himself as the victim of her selfish act. The impact of this traumatic event on Stalin's children provides another window into his callous nature. His son, Vasily, just 11 at the time, was told that his mother had died of appendicitis. The lie was maintained for years, preventing the boy from properly grieving or understanding what had happened. His daughter Svetlana, only 6, was given even less information and grew up believing her mother had simply disappeared. Yet even this horrific story pales in comparison to what Stalin did to the women who dared to enter his orbit after his wife's death. After Nadia's death in 1932, Stalin never officially remarried, but this didn't mean he lived in solitude. What followed was a series of relationships with women who faced fates that were often worse than his wives. These women, hidden from history, experienced horrors that reveal Stalin's capacity for cruelty on an intimate scale that rivals his political atrocities. The first of these secret relationships began barely 6 months after Nadia's funeral. Rosa Kaganovich was the sister of one of Stalin's closest political allies, Lazar Kaganovich. She was a party member, educated and politically engaged, exactly the kind of independent woman who would both attract and ultimately threaten Stalin. Rosa was 32 when she began her relationship with Stalin, making her one of the few women in his life who approached him as an equal rather than a subordinate. This dynamic fascinated Stalin initially, but it quickly became a source of conflict as his need for absolute control clashed with her strong personality. Their relationship lasted nearly 2 years, during which Rosa lived in a state of constant anxiety. Stalin's behavior toward her followed the same patterns he had established with Nadia: initial charm followed by increasing control, surveillance, and psychological manipulation. But Rosa, being older and more experienced, recognized these patterns and began to resist. The resistance proved fatal. In early 1935, Rosa suddenly disappeared from Moscow. Official records claim she was reassigned to work in a remote agricultural station in Siberia, but no trace of her was ever found at the supposed destination. Her brother Lazar, despite his close relationship with Stalin, never spoke publicly about her disappearance and seemed genuinely terrified whenever her name was mentioned. Years later, documents discovered in Soviet archives revealed that Rosa had been arrested on charges of anti-Soviet activity just days after she had attempted to end her relationship with Stalin. The charges were completely fabricated, based on testimony from household staff who claimed to have overheard her making critical comments about government policies. She was sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp, but her name disappears from all records after her initial processing. What makes Rosa's case particularly chilling is that Stalin attended a dinner at her brother's house just 1 week after her arrest. Lazar later confided to his diary that Stalin seemed to take perverse pleasure in discussing agricultural policies and labor camp conditions while sitting at Rosa's usual place at the table. He described Stalin as having the demeanor of a cat that had caught and disposed of a troublesome mouse. The pattern continued with alarming regularity. Historians have identified at least 7 women who had romantic relationships with Stalin between 1935 and 1945, and not one of them survived to see the end of the war. Each followed a similar trajectory: initial attraction to Stalin's power, growing horror at his true nature, attempts to distance themselves, and then sudden disappearance under mysterious circumstances. One of the most documented cases involves Lydia Timoshuk, a doctor who worked at the Kremlin hospital. Their relationship began in 1938 when she was treating Stalin for chronic stomach problems. Lydia was highly educated, politically naive, and initially impressed by Stalin's intellectual capacity and apparent dedication to socialist ideals. The relationship progressed quickly, with Stalin installing Lydia in a private apartment near the Kremlin and showering her with gifts and privileges, typically reserved for high-ranking party members. But Lydia's medical training made her unusually perceptive about Stalin's psychological state, and she began to recognize signs of severe personality disorders in his behavior. Her medical notes from the period, discovered decades later, reveal a woman grappling with the realization that she was intimately involved with someone she described as a patient exhibiting classic signs of paranoid personality disorder with psychopathic tendencies. She noted his complete lack of empathy, his pleasure in others' suffering, and his inability to form genuine emotional connections. When Lydia attempted to end their relationship in early 1939, citing professional ethics and personal concerns, Stalin's response was swift and merciless. Within a week, she was accused of poisoning patients at the hospital and plotting to assassinate government officials. The charges were absurd. She had actually saved lives through her medical expertise, but they provided the pretext Stalin needed. Lydia was arrested in her apartment during a dinner that Stalin himself had arranged. Witnesses reported that he watched from a window across the street as she was dragged away, showing no emotion except what one observer described as mild satisfaction. She was tortured for 3 months before being executed, with the interrogation records revealing that her captors were particularly interested in her psychological observations about Stalin. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these secret relationships was Stalin's apparent enjoyment of the process. He seemed to derive genuine pleasure from the cycle of seduction, control, resistance, and elimination. Former bodyguards later testified that he would often discuss these women with casual cruelty, describing them as experiments in human behavior. The woman known only as Vera represents one of the most tragic cases. She was a young translator who worked with foreign diplomats and caught Stalin's attention in 1941. Unlike the others, Vera attempted to avoid his advances entirely, perhaps sensing the danger. Her efforts to maintain professional distance only intensified Stalin's interest. Stalin used his position to orchestrate situations where Vera would be forced to spend time alone with him. He had her assigned to translate for private meetings that didn't exist, forcing her to sit in empty rooms while he subjected her to hours of increasingly personal questioning. When she finally agreed to have dinner with him, it was clearly out of fear rather than attraction. The relationship that followed was characterized by Stalin's complete indifference to Vera's obvious terror and discomfort. She was essentially held prisoner in a luxury apartment, unable to work or contact friends and family without his permission. Her letters home, which were secretly copied by Stalin's security services, reveal a woman in complete psychological collapse. Vera's end came when she made the mistake of confiding in her sister about her situation. The sister, hoping to help, approached a party official about the apparent kidnapping. Within days, both women were arrested on charges of espionage. Vera's sister was executed immediately, while Vera herself disappeared into the prison system, presumably to suffer a more prolonged punishment for her betrayal of Stalin's trust. The systematic nature of these disappearances suggests that Stalin had developed what can only be described as a predatory system for acquiring and disposing of women. He used his political power to identify potential victims, his security apparatus to isolate and control them, and his judicial system to eliminate them when they became inconvenient. But these secret relationships were only part of a broader pattern of abuse that extended to every woman in Stalin's orbit, including members of his own family. Stalin's cruelty toward women extended beyond his wives and mistresses to include the women who married into his family. His treatment of his daughters-in-law reveals a man who viewed any woman connected to him as property to be controlled, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed if they showed signs of independence or disloyalty. The first victim was Yulia Meltzer, who married Stalin's eldest son Yakov in 1928. Yakov had grown up largely without his father after Kato's death, and he approached his marriage with hopes of finally establishing some independence from Stalin's overwhelming influence. This hope proved tragically naive. From the moment Yulia entered the family, Stalin subjected her to scrutiny that bordered on obsessive. He had her background investigated exhaustively, despite her impeccable party credentials and family loyalty to the Bolshevik cause. He interrogated her about her political beliefs, her family connections, and even her intimate relationship with his son. Yulia was a strong-willed woman who initially tried to maintain her dignity In the face of Stalin's invasive behavior, she continued working as an engineer and maintained friendships outside the Stalin family circle. These signs of independence immediately marked her as a threat in Stalin's eyes. The psychological campaign against Yulia began with subtle undermining tactics. Stalin would make disparaging comments about her appearance, intelligence, and social background in front of family members and guests. He would deliberately exclude her from family gatherings or seat her in positions that emphasized her outsider status. When these tactics failed to break her spirit, Stalin escalated to more direct forms of harassment. He had her workplace monitored and began spreading rumors about her political reliability. Colleagues who had previously been friendly became distant and suspicious. Her work assignments became increasingly menial and isolated. The breaking point came when Yulia became pregnant in 1936. Rather than celebrating the prospect of a grandchild, Stalin saw the pregnancy as an opportunity to assert complete control over her life. He insisted on choosing her doctors, controlling her diet, and monitoring her activities with unprecedented intensity. Yulia later confided to friends that Stalin had made it clear he viewed the child as his property rather than hers. He spoke openly about his plans for the child's education and upbringing as if she were merely a vessel for producing the next generation of Stalins. When she attempted to assert some maternal authority, he reminded her that her continued presence in the family was entirely dependent on his goodwill. The child, Gulia, was born in 1938, but rather than easing the tension, her birth intensified Stalin's control over Yulia. He insisted on naming the child himself and made it clear that Yulia's role was limited to basic physical care. All decisions about the child's future would be his alone. When Yakov was deployed to military service in 1939, Stalin used his absence to further isolate Yulia. She was moved from the family apartment to smaller quarters and given limited access to her own child. Stalin would often take Gulia for extended periods without explanation, leaving Yulia in agonizing uncertainty about her daughter's well-being. The final tragedy came in 1941, when Yakov was captured by German forces during the early stages of the war. Stalin's reaction revealed the depth of his callousness, even toward his own family. He publicly declared that there were no prisoners of war, only traitors, effectively disowning his captured son. For Yulia, this pronouncement was devastating not just emotionally, but practically. As the wife of a declared traitor, she immediately became a target for arrest and persecution. Stalin made no effort to protect her, despite knowing that his own political rhetoric had sealed her fate. Within weeks of Yakov's capture, Yulia was arrested on charges of maintaining contact with enemies of the state. The evidence was entirely fabricated, based on letters she had written to Red Cross organizations attempting to learn about her husband's fate. Her desperate attempts to help her captured husband were twisted into proof of her treason. Yulia was sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp, while her young daughter Gulia was placed in an orphanage under a false name to hide her connection to the disgraced family. Stalin showed no interest in his granddaughter's welfare, treating her as another inconvenient reminder of his son's supposed failure. The conditions in Yulia's labor camp were particularly harsh, even by Soviet standards. Former prisoners later testified that she was specifically targeted for additional abuse because of her family connection to Stalin. Guards seemed to take pleasure in tormenting the former daughter-in-law of the Soviet leader, seeing it as a way to demonstrate their loyalty to Stalin's harsh judgment of his own family. Yulia survived barely 3 years in the camp before succumbing to what records list as pneumonia, though fellow prisoners reported that she had been systematically weakened by inadequate food, medical neglect, and deliberate exposure to harsh conditions. Her death in 1944 meant that she never learned that her husband Yakov had actually died heroically in German captivity, choosing execution rather than cooperation with Nazi propaganda efforts. Stalin's treatment of his second daughter-in-law, Galina Berdanskaya, followed a similar but even more accelerated pattern of control and destruction. Galina married Stalin's son Vasily in 1941, at the height of his father's power and paranoia. Galina was barely 18 when she married into the Stalin family, making her particularly vulnerable to psychological manipulation. She had grown up in a privileged Moscow family and was completely unprepared for the toxic dynamics of Stalin's household. From the beginning, Stalin treated Galina not as a family member, but as a potential security threat. He subjected her to constant surveillance and interrogation about her activities, friendships, and even her private conversations with his son. The young woman quickly developed symptoms of severe anxiety and depression under this relentless scrutiny. Stalin's control over Galina extended to every aspect of her life, including her appearance and behavior at social functions. He would critique her clothing choices, her conversation topics, and even her facial expressions at public events. The constant criticism left her perpetually nervous and self-conscious. When Galina gave birth to Stalin's grandson Alexander in 1942, she hoped that motherhood might soften her father-in-law's treatment. Instead, Stalin became even more controlling, treating the baby as state property and limiting Galina's parental authority to basic physical care. The psychological abuse escalated when Vasily began showing signs of alcoholism, partly in response to the pressure of living under his father's expectations. Rather than addressing his son's problems, Stalin blamed Galina for being a bad influence and failing to properly support her husband's career. In 1943, Stalin orchestrated the dissolution of the marriage, using fabricated evidence of Galina's supposed infidelity to justify his son's divorce. The evidence consisted of letters that had clearly been forged and testimony from household staff who had been coerced into making false statements. Galina was stripped of all financial support and prohibited from seeing her young son. She was essentially exiled from Moscow and forced to live in a small provincial town where she worked in a factory under constant surveillance. The isolation and stigma of being a divorced Stalin family member left her completely vulnerable to further persecution. In 1946, Galina was arrested on charges of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda based solely on comments she had allegedly made about her treatment by the Stalin family. She was sentenced to 8 years in a labor camp, where she died in 1948, under circumstances that were never fully investigated. Her son Alexander grew up never knowing his mother, told only that she had been a traitor who abandoned her family for foreign enemies. It wasn't until after Stalin's death that he learned the truth about his mother's fate and his grandfather's role in orchestrating her destruction. But Stalin's abuse of women in his family reached its most disturbing peak in his treatment of his own daughter, Svetlana, whose romantic relationships became battlegrounds for his controlling obsessions. Perhaps no woman suffered more prolonged psychological torture at Stalin's hands than his own daughter, Svetlana Alliluyeva. Her story reveals the full extent of her father's capacity for cruelty, as he systematically destroyed every relationship she attempted to form and turned her life into a prison of isolation and fear. Svetlana was only 6 years old when her mother died, and from that moment forward, Stalin treated her not as a beloved daughter, but as a possession to be controlled and manipulated according to his whims. He recognized that she was intelligent, strong-willed, and capable of independent thought, qualities that simultaneously fascinated and threatened him. During her childhood and adolescence, Stalin maintained tight control over every aspect of Svetlana's education and social development. He chose her teachers, monitored her friendships, and even dictated what books she could read. Any sign of independent thinking or questioning was quickly suppressed through a combination of intimidation and emotional manipulation. As Svetlana reached her teenage years, Stalin's control became particularly focused on preventing any romantic relationships. He seemed to view her potential sexuality as a direct threat to his authority over her, and he employed increasingly extreme measures to isolate her from age-appropriate social interactions. When Svetlana was 17, she fell in love with Alexei Kapler, a Jewish filmmaker who was 20 years her senior. Kapler was an established artist with international connections, exactly the kind of person Stalin viewed as a dangerous foreign influence. The relationship, which began innocently with shared interests in literature and film, quickly became a flashpoint for Stalin's controlling rage. Stalin's initial response was to forbid the relationship entirely, expecting his daughter to comply with his wishes, as she had throughout her childhood. When Svetlana showed signs of rebellion, continuing to see Kapler secretly, Stalin escalated his tactics with characteristic ruthlessness. Rather than simply punishing his daughter directly, Stalin chose to destroy Kapler as a warning about the consequences of defying his will. Kapler was arrested on fabricated charges of being a British spy and sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp. The evidence against him was entirely manufactured, consisting of forged documents and coerced testimony from associates who feared for their own lives. Stalin made sure that Svetlana understood her role in Kapler's fate. He told her explicitly that her continued defiance had sealed her lover's doom, and that any future relationships would result in similar consequences for the men involved. The message was clear. Her affections were weapons that Stalin could use to destroy anyone who gained her loyalty. The psychological impact on Svetlana was devastating. She had witnessed firsthand her father's willingness to destroy an innocent man simply to maintain control over her personal life. The guilt and fear of causing harm to anyone she cared about began to shape all her future relationships. In 1944, seeking to establish some independence, Svetlana married Grigory Morozov, a fellow student at Moscow University. Morozov was Jewish, which particularly enraged Stalin, who had become increasingly anti-Semitic in his later years. However, because Svetlana was already pregnant, Stalin reluctantly agreed to the marriage while making his displeasure abundantly clear. From the beginning, Stalin treated Morozov with open contempt and hostility. He refused to invite his son-in-law to family gatherings, made disparaging comments about his background and profession, and created a hostile environment that made normal family relationships impossible. The constant stress and humiliation began to take a toll on Morozov's health and career prospects. Stalin's campaign against his daughter's husband intensified after the birth of their son Joseph in 1945. Rather than celebrating his grandson, Stalin seemed to resent the child's existence as evidence of his daughter's independence from his control. He insisted on naming the boy after himself, but showed little interest in actually developing a relationship with him. The marriage couldn't survive the constant pressure and manipulation. By 1947, Svetlana and Morozov were divorced, with Stalin having successfully destroyed another of his daughter's relationships through psychological warfare rather than direct confrontation. Svetlana's next serious relationship, with Yuri Zhdanov, son of a prominent party official, followed a similar pattern, but with even more disturbing elements. Stalin initially approved of this relationship because of the political connections it represented, but his approval came with conditions that revealed the depth of his psychological control over his daughter. Stalin insisted on being involved in every aspect of the courtship, from approving their meeting locations to monitoring their conversations. He treated their relationship as a political alliance that he was orchestrating rather than a personal connection between two young people. When they married in 1949, Stalin made it clear that he viewed his new son-in-law as an employee rather than a family member. The marriage produced a daughter, Katya, in 1950, but even the birth of another grandchild failed to soften Stalin's controlling behavior. If anything, he became more possessive of Svetlana, as if the responsibility of motherhood had made her even more valuable as a possession to be controlled. Stalin's treatment of Svetlana during this period reveals his complete inability to view women, even his own daughter, as autonomous individuals. He monitored her daily activities, controlled her finances, and made decisions about her children's care and education without consulting her. When she showed any signs of resistance, he would remind her of what had happened to Kapler and others who had corrupted her judgment. The psychological pressure intensified when Stalin began experiencing health problems in the early 1950s. Rather than mellowing his control over Svetlana, his awareness of mortality seemed to make him more desperate to maintain absolute authority over her life. He began making plans for her future that extended far beyond his own death, as if he could control her even from the grave. In 1952, Svetlana's marriage to Yuri Zhdanov ended in divorce, largely due to the impossible pressures of living under Stalin's scrutiny. The pattern was now clear. Any man who became involved with Svetlana would face either destruction or psychological torture until the relationship became unbearable. Stalin's response to this second failed marriage was to impose even stricter controls on his daughter's life. She was essentially confined to her apartment, except for approved activities, and her social contacts were limited to people who had been vetted and approved by his security services. At 32, she was living like a prisoner in a luxurious cell. The final chapter of this psychological torture came with Svetlana's relationship with Brajesh Singh, an Indian communist who was visiting Moscow in 1963, long after Stalin's death. Even though her father had been dead for 10 years, his psychological conditioning had been so thorough that Svetlana still struggled to form normal relationships. When Singh died suddenly of a heart attack, she was convinced that somehow her father's curse was still operating from beyond the grave. It was this relationship, and Singh's unexpected death, that finally pushed Svetlana to take the dramatic step of defecting to the United States in 1967. Her defection was not just a political act, but a psychological break from the prison her father had created around her entire life. In her memoirs, written after her escape, Svetlana described the decades of psychological manipulation she had endured as more devastating than any physical abuse could have been. She wrote about the constant fear that caring for anyone would lead to their destruction, and the crushing guilt of knowing that her father had used her emotions as weapons against innocent people. The true horror of Stalin's treatment of his daughter lies not just in the cruelty of his actions, but in their calculated nature. He had systematically destroyed her ability to trust, to love freely, or to form normal human relationships. Even decades after his death, she continued to struggle with the psychological damage he had inflicted through his obsessive need to control every aspect of her existence. But as devastating as Stalin's treatment of his family members was, his systematic targeting of women throughout Soviet society reveals an even broader pattern of gender-based persecution that affected millions. The personal horrors Stalin inflicted on the women in his immediate circle were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader, systematic persecution of women throughout Soviet society. His pathological need to control and destroy women extended far beyond his household, creating policies and practices that terrorized millions of mothers, wives, and daughters across the Soviet Union. Stalin's approach to women's roles in society reflected his deeply personal beliefs about female subordination and the threat that independent women posed to male authority. While Soviet propaganda promoted images of liberated women working as equals alongside men, the reality under Stalin was far more sinister. Women who showed signs of independence, intelligence, or resistance to state authority faced persecution that was often more severe and sexualized than what their male counterparts experienced. The pattern began early in Stalin's rise to power with his treatment of prominent female Bolsheviks who had fought alongside Lenin during the revolution. These women, who had risked their lives for the communist cause, found themselves systematically marginalized and eventually eliminated as Stalin consolidated his control over the party. Alexandra Kollontai, who had served as the world's first female ambassador, was one of the few to survive, but only because she carefully avoided challenging Stalin directly and accepted exile to diplomatic posts far from Moscow. Other female revolutionaries were less fortunate. They were accused of various crimes against the state, subjected to show trials that focused obsessively on their personal lives and sexual relationships, and then executed or sent to labor camps where conditions were deliberately harsh for women. The Great Purge of the 1930s saw Stalin's anti-female paranoia reach unprecedented levels. Women were arrested in massive numbers, often on charges that revealed Stalin's particular obsession with female loyalty and sexuality. The NKVD files from this period show a disturbing pattern of interrogation techniques specifically designed for female prisoners, focusing on their intimate relationships and using sexual humiliation as a primary tool of psychological breakdown. Female prisoners were subjected to forms of abuse that male prisoners rarely experienced. They were forced to undergo invasive medical examinations under the guise of searching for hidden messages or weapons. They were stripped of their clothing during interrogations and forced to endure questioning while naked, a technique designed to create maximum psychological vulnerability. The testimonies of survivors reveal that female political prisoners were often housed in conditions deliberately designed to break their spirit and dignity. They were denied basic sanitary supplies, forced to share cells with common criminals who had been instructed to terrorize them, and subjected to medical experiments that served no purpose other than to inflict suffering. What makes these systematic abuses particularly horrifying is the evidence that Stalin personally reviewed and approved many of the interrogation techniques used on female prisoners.